Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Film Forum at Home. My name is Joseph Berger, and I am the Theater Operations and Events Manager at Film Forum, an independent, not-for-profit, four-screen cinema in Manhattan's West Village. This year, 2020, celebrates Film Forum's 50th anniversary. I'm speaking to you all live from my office on Houston Street. This is our 7th virtual event while the theater is temporarily closed. So first and foremost, we wish you all health and happiness at this time. We are thrilled tonight to co-present this event with the Bellevue Literary Review. In case you don't already know, BLR publishes 2 issues annually, filled with poetry, fiction, and nonfiction on the themes of health, illness, and healing, all, of course, relevant to tonight's subject, Oliver Sacks. You can learn more at blreview.org. Tonight's conversation is on the new documentary, Oliver Sacks, His Own Life, directed by Rick Burns. Dr. Sacks was a complicated man of infinite compassion whose scientific and literary achievements made him both a beloved writer and a respected public intellectual. He wrote books like The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and Awakenings, which turned case histories into compelling stories of living, breathing people. The film draws upon extensive interviews with Dr. Sacks made just after he learned that he is dying. Writing in Variety, Owen Gleiberman called the film a portrait at once tender and thrilling, a movie that presents us with a man who led an eccentrically defiant, at times reckless existence. Film Forum is pleased to present this title on our virtual cinema platform. If you have yet to see the film, rent it at filmforum.org. I'd love to welcome our guest moderator tonight. She can come on into the Zoom webinar. Our guest moderator is Danielle Orfi. Danielle is the editor-in-chief of the Bellevue Literary Review. She has been a practicing physician at Bellevue Hospital for more than 2 decades and is a clinical professor of medicine at NYU. Danielle writes for the New York Times, and her newest book is titled When We Do Harm, A Doctor Confronts Medical Error. A very special thanks to Danielle for putting this event together. Congratulations. Hi, Danielle.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
We have about 200 people in our Zoom window already, so this is great. Filmmaker Rick Burns sends his regards to the audience. He is unable to join tonight due to non-COVID illness, which is a shame because without him, this film would not have been the moving portrait that it is. Rick founded Steeplechase Films in 1989 and has been writing, directing, and producing award-winning historical documentaries for nearly 30 years, since his collaboration on the PBS series The Civil War from 1990, which he produced with his brother Ken Burns and co-wrote with Jeffrey Ward. He is perhaps best known for his 8-part, 17-hour series, New York, a Documentary Film. In 2006, Film Forum premiered his documentary on Andy Warhol. Despite Rick not being here, we are very, very lucky to have our next 2 special guests tonight, 2 people who were closest to Oliver Sacks. Writer and photographer Bill HAYES, come on in. Bill was Oliver's partner. His books include Insomniac City, New York, Oliver and Me, and How We Live Now, Scenes from the Pandemic, published, I believe, just last month in August, which is about the current pandemic. Is that correct, Bill?
That's right. Yes. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Bill has also served as co-editor of Dr. Sacks's posthumous books. Bill's also a subject of the film. And our final guest tonight, another subject of the film, is Kate Edgar. Please welcome Kate. Kate began working with Oliver as editor and researcher in 1983. She contributed to all 16 of his books, including the recently published Everything in Its Place. For over 3 decades, Kate traveled the world with Dr. Sacks and knew many of his patients and subjects. I'm really thrilled to have all 3 of you with us tonight. Thank you so much for being here. A huge congratulations on the film. It's moving and beautiful. I just saw it, and I can't wait to hear you guys discuss it. So I'll see you all in about 45 minutes.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Welcome, Kate. Welcome, Bill. Welcome all of you watching on the Zoom, on the live stream. We're so thrilled you can be with us. If you haven't seen the movie, it is one of the most touching films I have seen in a long time. And bring your hanky. It's really quite beautiful. And we're so sad that Rick, the last minute, became ill. such is life, but we miss him a lot. So, we think of Oliver as mainly as a writer, not as a movie star, but here he is, a true movie star. Kate, maybe you could tell us a bit how this writer came to be in a movie like this.
Well, it's an incredible story, actually, timing-wise. Oliver had just, in December of 2014, he had handed in the manuscript for his autobiography called On the Move. And we were all excited to have this book come out. And then a couple of weeks later, he got the terrible news that his cancer had metastasized and that he only had less than a year to live. And as he absorbed this news, he really felt, number one, we wanted to bring the book out as soon as possible so he could be alive when it was published. And thankfully, we were able to do that. But number two, he really wanted to go on film and leave this last testament, really, talking about his life. And, to some degree, it started with the idea of reading parts of the book on film. But of course, it quickly evolved into something much bigger than that. Oliver reminiscing about all different parts of his life, many different subjects. So that's how it all began.
It's interesting because, I heard Rick speak in other interviews about how normally a movie takes quite a long time to come together and get permissions and contracts. But this movie, because of the timing, really had to undergo a different kind of time schedule. Bill, do you want to talk about what it was like to just get this actually accomplished?
It's true. He went from 1 week, just reading parts of the book to friends, to a couple weeks later, there was a whole film crew in this apartment, blacking out windows and putting up lights and filming for 8 to 10 hours a day. It all happened very quickly and beautifully, as if it was just meant to be.
When we see the movie and when we read the book, and I brought my copy, which is very heavily annotated. It's such a beautiful book. We learn that Oliver Sacks grew up painfully shy, and that was almost a defining characteristic of him.
Yeah.
But in the movie, he doesn't seem shy at all. He seems completely at ease, holding court. It seems, did something change? Is it the circumstance? Tell us about that.
No, he was a very shy person, but paradoxically, he could be extremely gregarious. When he was before an audience, he knew how to charm an audience. And I think in this case, well, first of all, he was ready. He was ready to talk, to get things off his chest. He immediately really trusted Rick Burns, the filmmaker, and his team. They were all so discreet and gracious and so good at their jobs. They made it very easy and comfortable. I think in the situation of the filming, he's surrounded by family and friends, people he loved and admired and trusted most here in this apartment. So it was almost as if Oliver was hosting a dinner party or a cocktail party that went on all day long for a week. But in addition, I think not only surrounded by the people he loved, but the things he loved. This is where the film was filmed. And his piano, his books, his ferns and plants, his collection of minerals and elements and periodic tables. So he was very much in his element, and I think just comfortable and ready to talk. And on top of that, I think it was all just kind of a fun adventure for him.
What struck me, Kate, you've worked with Oliver in so many books, and so many of them involve case studies, the close observation of a patient who's the subject. And it struck me that a biographical documentary is somewhat like a case study. I don't know if you saw a parallel, or did it feel like something different compared to the way you and Oliver would tackle the case of a patient?
Well, obviously there are differences in the medium itself, but no, Oliver always spoke about the intersection of biology and biography. And for him, a case history was not just the biology of a patient's illness, but the biography of that person, of that individual. So it was a very all-encompassing look at each person he wrote about. So yes, I think they're very parallel in a lot of ways.
Abraham Verghese has written, he wrote a wonderful essay about what doctors can learn from novelists. And he wrote about the idea that although it's the patient's story, the doctor, whether by choice or not, becomes a character in that story. And do you think Oliver became a character in his patient's stories?
Well, very much so, and in different ways. I think he probably thought of himself as a bit of a Scheherazade, telling these stories. I think he was very imbued as a child with 19th century literature, both scientific writing and fiction, and of course he loved Sherlock Holmes. So there's a lot of Sherlock Holmes and solving a mystery.
Mhm.
And describing in minute detail the physiognomy of somebody or the way they move or these clues to what's going on with them. So I think he played many different characters. Sometimes, of course, he himself was the patient that he wrote about in a few cases. And at the same time, he plays a sort of Greek chorus role where he's talking to us, the readers, and trying to give us the background of this is what Tourette syndrome is like, and this is the history of how we learned about Tourette syndrome or autism or whatever condition he was talking about.
Yeah, I like to think of him as the interpreter of maladies, to use Jhumpa
Oh,
Lahiri's.
that's wonderful.
He
Yeah.
really did for us, the lay audience, even the medical audience, the non-neurologists, and even the neurologists. He really did interpret these unusual syndromes and case studies of life. And we think of him so much as a writer, but he was also a ferocious reader. And Bill, I think you're sitting in part of his library. Can you tell us a bit about Oliver as a reader?
Oh, well, he was a voracious reader, very diverse taste. He had about 10,000 books in this apartment, and like library labels for the different categories. Everything from ferns to swimming to neurology, of course, psychiatry, Darwin, Freud, philosophy, religion. And I know all this because I sorted his books after his death. He had a whole collection of dictionaries, not only the full 20-volume Oxford English Dictionary, but other dictionaries of slang. He would take a dictionary to bed, even to read. And a day didn't go by, did it, Kate, that he wouldn't look up words in the dictionary. The most surprising thing I learned about Oliver as a reader really came after his death when I was sorting his library and found that he annotated thousands of books. You see a little bit of it in the film, but here's a collection of Leibniz's essays. And you can see how he wrote in the margins, almost having a dialogue with the author, whether it was Darwin or Leibniz in this case, or a philosopher, or Freud or Darwin. Yeah. So filling the books with his own notes and thoughts and in dialogue with the authors.
I was so intrigued that when he was a child, he really created a bit of a cone of silence for himself in his laboratory, in his room, with his books, keeping out the chaos, his brother's illness, schizophrenia, the chaos at home. And we learn in the film that his first friends were numbers, elements, plants, and humanity kind of came in last, people. And yet he grew into such a close observer of humans. Kate, how do you think he sort of came to this fascination with humans, leaving the inanimate, coming from the inanimate side of things?
Yeah, my guess is that as a very young child, you see these photographs of him and he's just brimming with life and excitement. And I think he was the darling of the family. And I suspect he had perfectly great human relationships at that point. But when he was sent away during the war, as parents did in London at the time to protect their children, he just entered such a traumatic situation. It turned out to be a very sadistic boarding school that he was isolated in with his brother Michael. And, as you say, his brother was becoming ill. So when he came back, yes, he definitely took refuge in science and numbers and the inanimate. But I think also as he grew up, his parents were both great storytellers in their own ways. And I think he was intrigued by those stories and the stories that he read in books, and began to realize that nothing in the world was more interesting than the human brain. And at that point, I think probably about midway through what we would call high school, he kind of shifted to going into medicine rather than becoming a marine biologist.
Right. All the books that we've read by Oliver Sacks over the years, he's mostly chronicling other people's lives. He does chronicle his life a bit in Leg to Stand On, a few things, but it's a bit exterior. But suddenly, with On the Move, he really turns to himself in a deep and introspective way that we had never seen before. And that's quite a change, especially for someone who is so shy and so guarded in so many ways. Bill, can you tell us a little bit about what, caused him to sort of turn that corner and turn the lens in a way that was really something new and unique?
I think it was something that did come with age as he got older, that he was more comfortable with himself and ready to tell some of these stories. I think both Kate and I would often say to him, as he would tell stories about his life, things that people maybe didn't know about him, whether his sexuality or drug use or funny stories. And we would say, Oliver, we can't tell these stories. Only you can tell them. So just write them down, get them down. And I think in the beginning, we persuaded him to do this thinking, don't even worry about publishing them. Just get them down. And they started to come out one after the other after the other. I remember especially the early chapters of On the Move, how beautifully they flowed out of him and with such candor and such beautiful lyricism. And before Oliver knew it, but I think Kate and I may have realized even before Oliver, there was a beautiful memoir or autobiography coming together, which is almost like a sequel to Uncle Tungsten, his earlier memoir about his childhood. But in the beginning, the writing was done as if it was just for posterity, but very soon a memoir was taking shape. And I think On the Move is really one of his very best books. And I think it contributes to this film that he had just completed the manuscript, as Kate said, just weeks before the diagnosis. He was proud of that book. He knew it was a good book. He knew it was a very candid book, and he was ready to talk about it. He sort of had his script in a certain way and was ready for Rick Burns and his team once filming started.
I mean, it is a fantastic book. If anyone out there has not read it, even if you've seen the movie, you still should read the book because Oliver's way of portraying his life is indescribable. When I first read the book, I knew him, at that stage in his life. To imagine him as a weightlifter in Venice Beach, that was a new one for me. Leathers, motorcycling, the drug use. And I think for a lot of people, that was quite, we think of Dr. Sacks, the avuncular Victorian, gentle wit kind of gentleman, pumping iron, that he won a weightlifting contest. How do you think that affected his image, and how do you think it's changed sort of his legacy?
Kate?
I'll let you jump in on that one.
It's funny. That's a really great question, and I feel like asking the audience that question. But of course, we knew these things about him before that, so it's hard to separate the two. I like to think that it doesn't affect his legacy, except to say he was a very complex human being, and he fought for everything he got, and so he had an incredible tenacity within, even though he was shy and found it difficult to act in many situations. He knew what he wanted to do, and he did it. And I have to tell you that those last 9 months of his life, he was incredibly productive. This was it.
Yeah.
So I mean, time will tell if these, the facts of his life affect his legacy. I think that they just make him a more real person.
I mean, I'll agree with that. I think for many people, certainly from my reading of it, I got this new understanding that he seems so incredibly human because he seemed from the outside perfect. And here he was writing a book a year and seeing patients and managing all of this somehow, taking piano lessons, doing analysis. How he fit it all in staggers the mind. But I was impressed at the depth of his experience. The one scene that stood out to me was the patient who was dying, who never got out, and he took her out on his motorcycle, took her out for a nighttime ride. And that strikes me as what a doctor really needs to do when a patient needs something, and maybe it's not on the books or on the prescription pad. I was so impressed, even more than I already was, about the depths to which he could go.
Well, he was constantly doing things like that, and I don't think it comes up in this film, but he had another patient who was very disabled and never got out of the hospital, but was a huge Grateful Dead fan. And so this was back in like about 1991. So we arranged to take this patient out of the hospital, and the family in the hospital was like, "What are you doing?" We took him to Madison Square Garden to see a Grateful Dead concert and to meet the band. And Oliver was just always looking for those connections to make.
Just to get back to your question about his legacy and how the book and the film affects his legacy, I really think it enhances his legacy. He was sort of delighted, but I think surprised at how he became almost like a gay icon from the cover On the Move, that very studly picture of Oliver Sacks on his motorcycle in the early 60s, and Oliver Sacks that most people didn't know.
There you go, guys.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, how hot is that? I used to hold up that picture to Oliver and say, how could you not have had a boyfriend? How could you not have had a boyfriend before this? So these are the kinds of stories and even photographs that Kate and I knew he had and that we knew about. And we thought, you got to get these down and write them down. And so I think in his complexity, in his failures, in his tenacity, as Kate said, it just makes him more human, more lovable. I think there's going to be a whole new generation discovering Oliver Wolf Sacks, Wolf being his middle name.
Oliver was an inveterate writer, physically an inveterate writer. He scribbled all the time.
Yep.
And there's an archive now. And you can tell me how many cases of notebooks there are, but describe for the audience the archive. Kate, do you want to start?
Oh boy, well, it's hundreds of boxes. As you say, I forget, Billy, do you remember how many thousands of journals? He would always have a little hardbound book with him and be scribbling his thoughts or paragraphs or notes or shopping lists or whatever, but he always had a pocket full of pens. So that was, the sort of first instance of writing. And then he generated many versions of every manuscript he ever wrote. He would constantly rewrite and drive his many editors a little insane by sending them 9 or 10 different drafts.
All in longhand.
Yes, many in longhand. And he was a huge correspondent. He tried to reply to nearly every letter he received. And he kept copies of all of these things. So we also have boxes and boxes and boxes of letters that he wrote over the years. Some of them go back to the 1950s. Actually, earlier, I think some of the letters to his parents. So thankfully, he held on to all of those things, and we have a massive archive of it's a treasure trove for years of investigation, I suspect.
And in fact, that's how Oliver and I met. He read one of my books, a book called The Anatomist, and he wrote me a letter. I was living in San Francisco at the time and was completely surprised to get a letter in the mail, handwritten, from Oliver Sacks, whose books I had read and profiles in the New Yorker I had read. And it was just a very collegial, letters saying, "Congratulations, Mr. Hayes. I read your book and enjoyed it. And so what would you do if you got a letter from Oliver Sacks?" I wrote a letter back. And then he wrote a letter back to me. And I later discovered, of course, that he devoted time every day to correspondence, writing authors he didn't know, but also people who would write to him to talk about their conditions or disorders or have questions, letters to friends and family. As Kate said, there are thousands and thousands of letters. I think about up to 700 handwritten journals. He always had a fresh journal at hand in case he finished one. One of his favorite things to do when he traveled was to start a fresh journal. So you'd get on the airplane, get settled in, maybe a glass of champagne the stewardess would bring, and then he would break out a fresh journal, date it, and start writing. And he would write through the whole flight.
Yeah, especially I also met Dr. Sacks by writing a letter based on something I read in his book, and I got a letter back, and I treasure those letters. It's very special, and I'm so glad that he kept copies of both ends of the correspondence. You know, there was I wanted to ask the question which many people raise to all doctor writers: are doctors and nurse writers and other healthcare workers exploiting their patients when they use their stories? And there was that headline about Dr. Sacks, you know, the man who mistook his patients for a literary career. What's your thought on that, Kate? You've been by his side writing these case histories. How do you negotiate that line?
I would say that Oliver's motto in that regard was always tact and delicacy. And it's a very good question. And of course, things have changed in recent decades in terms of attitudes towards that. He was very concerned that his patients be comfortable with what he was writing. He often showed what he had written to the patient to say, "How do you feel about this? Is this okay? Is there anything that I have wrong? Is there anything we should change?" Or if the patient was unable, sometimes it would be part of the family. Of course, as is medical convention, he would try not to identify people. Although some of his patients, it ended up wanted to be identified. Part of the problem was that some of them were actually well-known figures. For instance, Temple Grandin. And so he had a process of very carefully fact-checking, very tactfully finding out, you know, would this person be open to being written about? And I can't really think of an example of anybody who objected to that. I think it was fundamentally based on the fact that he had already a very deep relationship of trust with this person. And he didn't meet people thinking, "Oh, I'm going to write about this person." It just developed organically after a number of encounters.
And I also wonder, I mean, for many patients, especially patients who have incurable disorders, you know, having a narrative framework, that is partly a treatment. I think for many patients who don't have a way to conceptualize what's happening to them, helping a patient create that story, one could look at that as a therapeutic process as well.
Absolutely. I think that's very true.
Bill, you're sitting by the piano, the beautiful piano, and there seems to be, I think, a special relationship between people in medicine and music. There are a number of doctors' orchestras throughout the world, quite a few in the US and in Europe. There are only a handful of lawyers' orchestras, and there are no accountants' orchestras. There's not a single accountant, not a single orchestra of tax collectors or direct marketers or politicians, but there are a lot of medical orchestras. And of course, Oliver had a very special relationship to music. Can you tell us a bit about what that relationship was like?
He really did. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of music, that is classical music. One area of music he did not know anything about was popular music. So much so that on the day that Michael Jackson died, I came into the apartment. I was a little bit distressed because I'd grown up with Michael Jackson's music. And I said Michael Jackson had died. And he said, what is Michael Jackson? He had no idea. He didn't say who, but what. But he did have an amazing knowledge of the history of music, composers. The Oxford Companion to Music was one of his favorite books, practically memorized. Yeah. It may be hard for people in the audience to imagine this, especially younger people, but in this apartment, when Oliver was alive, there was no technology, no computers, no Wi-Fi. He never sent an email or a text. The most advanced technology really in the apartment was Bose radios. Mm-hmm. And one of his few indulgences, he had 3 Bose radios, was to turn all 3 of them on to WQXR at the same time, one in the kitchen, one here in the living room, one in his bedroom. And so the whole apartment would just be drenched in music. And his favorite composer, without question, was Bach. He loved Mozart as well. And of course, you can see his piano right behind me. This is an 1894 Bechstein Grand piano, which his father bought, I think in 1930 or so. And then Oliver brought over from London in the late 70s. It's so large that it had to be moved in through a bank of windows. It doesn't even fit into an elevator. And yes, Oliver played piano nearly every day. He took a piano lesson once a week, nearly to the end of his life. And one of my favorite, fondest memories of life with Oliver was to come into the apartment and to hear him playing piano and to sit down on the floor next to him as he played some Bach.
Well, Kate, maybe you remember which birthday it was, 80 or 85. Someone gave him an iPod preloaded with all the works of Bach, and there's such a beautiful photograph of that.
Oh gosh, I don't know, but was that his 80th or maybe even his 75th? I'm not sure, because iPods, I think, yeah. Yes, of course he had no clue what that was.
I wanted to switch a little bit to his writing style, and I wanted to read just a few lines from his book about how he writes, and then we can talk a bit about that. He writes, "It seems to me that I discover my thoughts through the act of writing, in the act of writing. Occasionally, a piece comes out perfectly, but more often, my writings need extensive pruning and editing, because I may express the same thought in many different ways. I can get waylaid by tangential thoughts and associations in mid-sentence, and this leads to parentheses, subordinate clauses, sentences of paragraphic length. I never use one adjective if 6 seem to me better." And Kate, you have edited his writing for a long time. Talk about his writing and also how it changed over the years.
Oh, gosh. Well, I think that over the years, he became more sure-footed in a way, more, I think, in the beginning, he kind of was trying to fit himself into this medical mold. So when he's writing Migraine or not some of the early medical papers that he wrote, he's trying to do it in this very sort of medicalese kind of format with references and some kind of tables of quantitative data. But that really wasn't him. And as he moved through his career, he became more and more comfortable with being a character himself in these essays that he was writing. I think that, speaking of the New Yorker, his experience of working with some of the editors there who are amazing really helped him to refine his style. And I think that he also, as time went on, he felt that he could allow himself to range into other kinds of writing. So, for instance, he would write about botany or swimming as well as neurological conditions. And that was very satisfying to him, yeah.
One of our viewers, Elizabeth, asked, what was it like when you saw his very first handwritten manuscript? What came out to you?
I said, oh boy, it was not only handwritten, but it was kind of splotchy, like, he'd written it in an ink pen and it had clearly gotten rained on or something, because there were these sort of splotches all over it. And I just thought, I don't know how I'm going to be able to type this. So I kind of spent a long time just sort of staring at it and trying to understand what the code was. It turned out, as he later explained to me, that he would write often. He would take weekends up in the Catskills at this little lakeside hotel, and he would keep his sheaf of paper and his pens on a table by the lake. And once a thought came to him while he was swimming, he would get out of the water and write what he was thinking. So this is why it began to be splotchy and difficult to read. But it is true, his writing was very difficult to decipher, and often the people who had received handwritten letters from him would write back and say, could you please provide a translation for this? I have no idea what it says.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. What is it like, and this is for both of you, to edit someone's work posthumously?
It's been really fascinating and really a privilege, I would say. Oliver knew as his death was approaching that there was a lot more material to be published. And many of you out there know of his New York Times essays from the last 8 months of his life, My Own Life being the first one, an essay which he reads in this film. And it's something I'm so grateful to Rick Burns and his team for filming. When he wrote that essay, it was just days after his diagnosis. And he set it aside, and I think the only people who had read it were Kate and I when he read it for Rick for the film. And it's great to have that record of him reading that piece, which only about a week later was then published in the New York Times to great acclaim. He wrote 2 other essays about facing his death and illness. And we did talk to him before his death about compiling those 3 essays in a little book. And he liked that idea, didn't he, Kate? And he also sketched out sort of a table of contents or an outline for a book called The River of Consciousness. And he knew that there was other material and left it to Kate and me and to his editor at Knopf, Dan Frank, to edit. But Kate, I was talking about Gratitude, the little book.
Absolutely. And, I just spied a question from the audience about the role of religion for Oliver. And the last essay in that book is called Sabbath.
Yeah.
And it's just a beautiful, beautiful essay. He was not, he did not believe in God as a religious figure. He believed in nature, but he loved Jewish ritual, and Sabbath is, he uses that almost as a metaphor. Sabbath was both his childhood of experiencing this sense of community and ritual, but it was also the Sabbath of his life. It was time for him to put his pen down and say, enough. So that's a very moving piece to me. And he had a great respect for religion for other people. And he spent many, many hours of his clinical week working at homes run by a Catholic order called the Little Sisters of the Poor. But for himself, he believed in science and nature.
What else is hiding in the archives? Are there more books coming out?
Well, we don't know what we might find. I'm sure there's plenty of material. I am working right now on a volume of selected letters because his letters are just marvelous. And so that will be coming. There's also a very talented biographer, Laura Snyder, is working on a biography of Oliver, which will draw on all the archival material. So we may find yet another picture of Oliver Sacks when that is done.
Bill, Wendy asks, might you actually make a book of his marginalia, of all of his comments in the books that he's read in his 10,000 volume library?
It's a great idea. I would love to do that. Really, he had a kind of innate graphic sense, whether writing letters or doing doodles. So I think there was a part of Oliver that enjoyed doing the annotations and writing in the margins. And you'll notice, as I showed you in the book, he used different colored pens. So there was some very specific thought that would go into it. Whether it was red and black or green, they had different meanings to him. Yeah, it's a possibility.
Yeah, I love that idea.
Yeah.
I wonder if I can also say, because I see that some people are asking about viewing this film in other countries, that it will be coming out in many different countries. And the best source for information on that as it becomes available is a website called oliversacksdoc.com. So doc for documentary.
Yeah, definitely worth seeing and worth reading. Also, the books. Someone asked about the name of the book of his early life. That was Uncle Tungsten, another wonderful book. Jill asks that Oliver Sacks seemed to be aware of his own contradictions, and so what role do you think secrecy played in his life and his writings?
Secrecy. Well, I think probably the biggest secret that he held was about his sexuality, that he was gay. And one of the amazing things about On the Move, as you'll see in the film, is how candid he is about that struggle that he had throughout his life, beginning with disclosing to his parents at a pretty tender young age, back in the 50s, that he was attracted to boys rather than girls. And his mother literally cursing him and saying, "You're an abomination." Something that stayed with him throughout his life, something he struggled with. But I think perhaps something that gave him a certain empathy for outsiders. When I met Oliver, and it was a kind of, almost like love at first sight kind of feeling, I was someone who had domestic and romantic relationships, and Oliver really had not. But he took it on with great curiosity and love and affection.
Carol asked what, for me and other writers in the medical field, what role did Oliver Sacks have kind of in the development of narrative medicine? It's a wonderful question because I think Oliver is sort of the patron saint of narrative medicine or medical writing, the doctor-writer epidemic, call it what you want. But I think before Oliver Sacks, no one really thought to write a story about a patient other than the note in the chart. I mean, there are clinical case studies in medical journals, but they're very, very removed and distant. But he was the first person to write in a way that received some popular notice, to write about the patient in their entire life, to see them within the tapestry of their life, because you don't live your life as a patient in those 5 minutes in the doctor's office. You live that in your 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in your home, with your illness, with your family. And I think he opened our eyes to the ways that we can understand our patients' lives by thinking more broadly. And I'm wondering, Kate, if you want to add anything to that.
I would just say that, ironically, it at one time, at the sort of dawn of neurology in the 19th century, when neurology became its own discipline, there were a lot more narrative reports, and these were the reports that he read. He loved these descriptions. They were very novelistic, and so I think he was really just reviving that grand tradition, which had been submerged by the development of sort of statistical double-blind kinds of medicine.
Sure. Bill, Michael asks if you could talk about the statue, the silhouette behind you. Is that a statue of some special meaning?
Well, I believe it was a gift to Oliver. It's Mercury. So the Greek god Mercury, I believe it was a gift to him on his, is it 80th, Kate?
Yeah. That's it. Yeah, okay. 80, Mercury is element number 80.
Right. And so as you'll find when you watch the film, and as you may know, Oliver was obsessed with the periodic table. And this apartment was filled with periodic table pillows and charts, and he could recite the periodic table, every number. You throw a number at him, he would tell you what the element is that matched it. For close friends and family members, he loved to give the element that matched your birthday. So when I turned 50, what did I get from my partner, Oliver? I got tin.
A lump of tin.
A lump of tin. I loved that about Oliver. So I think on his 80th birthday, a friend gave him this beautiful little statue of Mercury.
That actually came from his wonderful publishers at Vintage Books.
Yvette asked if each of you could talk about the first time you met Oliver and what that was like.
Well, first time I met him in person was on a visit to New York City. I had been living in San Francisco. We had corresponded, as I said earlier, and we met for lunch at a little place just across the street from his office. Oliver lived in this apartment and had an office just down the street. He had a form of agnosia, topographical agnosia. I don't know if I have that exactly right. He could lose his way very easily. So going to the exact same restaurant across the street from his office was easy for him. I just remember him being charming, shy, and he had the 4 different colored felt pens in his pen holder in his shirt pocket. And the most memorable thing from that lunch, he knew that I was a writer. He asked what I was working on. Was I writing anything? And I was kind of in a phase where I was a little bummed out and not writing much and not sure about my writing career. And he looked me in the eye and he said, "You must keep a journal. You must." He insisted. And I said, it was like instructions from up above. And I followed his instruction, thankfully, and started a journal. This was just after I moved to New York City, and I still do to this day. And I wrote a book called Insomniac City, much of which was drawn from my New York City journals.
Kate, how about you?
You know, I think that must have been the first time I met was at his publisher's office, where I was working at the time, Summit Books, and he was the most eccentric person I'd probably ever seen. And, you know, people would come into this New York City publisher's office. Authors would usually be kind of nicely dressed. And of course, Oliver had his shirt tail hanging out, and he had this huge manuscript that was, he tied it with a belt to keep it from falling apart. And, you know, shy, stuttering man. And I just thought, wow, that's really interesting.
Actually, Kate asked how Oliver's face blindness affected his daily life.
Oh gosh, a lot. I remember one day he came, and this is relatively late in his life. He came back to the apartment one day and said, I was just at the gym, and I saw this young man with a bald head, and I started talking to him. I thought it was Billy. And so he one time we were meeting at an agent's office, and I'd been working for him for, 10 years. And since I was in the waiting room of this office, he had no idea who I was, because I wasn't in the context of being in a place we knew we were at. So it was hard. He learned how to identify people by the color of their hair, or their dog, or the way they walked. But I think it did influence his deep shyness. He was never quite sure who he was talking to.
I remember when we were first courting, as he would say, and I would come in and out of this apartment building, and I couldn't figure out at first why I seemed to know his neighbors' names better than he did. Because even though he was friendly, he didn't necessarily recognize neighbors in his own building. But one point I want to make about his prosopagnosia, his face blindness, when he did write about it, and it was excerpted in the New Yorker for thousands of people or more around the world. It was the first time that a term had been given to this condition they had, where they realized they didn't recognize people as well as most other people did. I've had so many people say to me, until I read Dr. Sacks's piece on face blindness, his own face blindness, I didn't know it was a recognized disorder. And so I think just even an essay like that shows the kind of influence he had in a beautifully written personal essay that put a name to a condition that is a lot more common than most people thought.
Right. Bill, someone asked if you would comment on what it was like to be part of Oliver's coming out.
Well, it was a great delight to see him finally become so comfortable that he could talk candidly about being gay, write candidly about being gay, and introduce me as his partner. It was a long journey, I will say that. And no one pushed him out of the closet. He walked out with great dignity himself. But yes, it was a very long journey for him, but he made it. And one of the sweetest, fondest, funniest memories I have is of the two of us going to Oliver Sacks Night, as it was called, at Julius Gay Bar here in New York City in the West Village, which is one of the oldest gay bars in the country. And they had created an Oliver Sacks themed night based on that Studley cover of On the Move, Oliver on his motorbike. And, they hadn't contacted Dr. Sacks. We wouldn't have known about it if it weren't for Troy at Three Lives and Company bookstore, who said, Dr. Sacks, are you going to Dr. Sacks night at Julius? And so, of course, we went, and he was cheered and toasted, and a drag queen took him by the arm and got him a stool and a beer, and he met lots of people, gay men and women and others, who inevitably lined up just to thank him for what he had done and how he had impacted their life.
That is really wonderful. I know we're coming to a close soon, and there are so many questions still there. I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. A few people have asked about seeing the movie, and if you came through the BLR, and if you didn't get your movie link, you can write to us and we'll make sure you get it. If you haven't watched the movie yet, Oliver Sacks Doc, is that the website, Kate?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that will help you find places to see the movie virtually, hopefully soon, in person. I just want to thank everyone for being here. We've really enjoyed talking and wish we could talk for another 3 hours.
Thank you so much, Danielle.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I want to say thank you to everyone. This was absolutely a fabulous event. And I didn't know very much about Oliver before the film. And I was just amazed at how many layers were, exposed and peeled back in just 2 hours. And I feel like we could do this for another 2 hours and there would still be layers to peel back. One question I had that I've been sort of bringing back to our guests with these virtual events, I'm wondering, Kate and Bill, if you've thought about what Oliver might think about the current moment we're in, arguably the greatest public health issue in a century, and modern society kind of coping with a certain level of isolationism and quarantine. I wonder if you've thought, what would Oliver think? And then maybe what might Oliver think?
Very much so. And, he was very aware of the pandemic flu from 1917, which figures in his book Awakenings. But I think he would be so distressed to realize that the people who are trying to lead the country are not really paying enough attention to what the scientists are saying. I think he would urge everyone to absolutely be wearing masks and social distancing as we are right now. And I think he would be very distressed at how things have been going so far, and want people to take care of each other.
Bill, do you feel the same?
Oh, I absolutely do, and a lot of people have asked me this same question. I agree. He would make the link to the 1917 pandemic. I think he would not have been surprised by the range of symptoms with COVID, that there are sometimes even neurological effects and symptoms. He certainly saw that with his awakenings patients, that there could be a whole range of manifestations from a single disease. I think he would be absolutely, as Kate said, distressed, dismayed, and horrified by the Trump presidency and how it has not led in this pandemic. And I think, lastly, as an elderly man, he would have been concerned for himself, and very distressed about the conditions in nursing homes and convalescent hospitals, the kinds of places where Oliver really worked, back wards of hospitals and convalescent homes, where so many people have died.
And if I can add, by 8 months into the pandemic, he would have had, what, 50 journals filled? 60? What do you
Probably so.
Yeah. And he would have written about it.
A great moment to encourage everyone to vote in a few weeks. And the last thing I want to ask everyone is, what's next? What are you working on? Do you have anything down the pipeline? Maybe we'll start with Danielle, and then Kate, and then Bill.
Sure. So I just published the book about medical error, but I've been writing a big article on COVID, which will be coming out this week in the New Yorker.
Okay, well, as I mentioned earlier, I'm working hard on this book of selected correspondence from Oliver, and we are publishing new editions. In fact, today we published a new edition of his 1984 book called A Leg to Stand On. And we're publishing a new edition of The Man Who Mistook His Wife next year.
And I just published a new book, as I said, called How We Live Now, which is writing and photography about the first 100 days of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And next up for me is completing a book on the history of exercise, which is called Sweat. That should be coming in about a year and a half.
Wow, what inspired that? I'm a 13-time marathoner, so
oh my gosh,
I will buy your book. But what inspired that?
Well, I've always loved exercise and working out, and I would say Oliver had something to do with it. He was a great swimmer, loved to swim, and one of the only requirements he had with participating in this film by Rick Burns was that every day at 12 noon, he would be able to take a break and go for a swim. So we would leave the filmmakers and drive over to Chelsea Piers, and Oliver would do his half mile or mile of swimming, come back refreshed, and talk into the night.
Well, before I say goodbye to all of you and I sign off here, Julius's is right around the corner from Film Forum, so I'm headed over there to have a martini in Oliver's name.
Excellent.
And thank you all so much. This was fantastic.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Again, I encourage all of you to go to our website, filmforum.org, and rent Oliver Sacks' His Own Life by Rick Burns. Another huge word of thanks to Danielle and everyone at the Bellevue Literary Review. Be sure to visit blreview.org and learn more. I'd also like to thank Bonnie LaFave and Lee Howell at Steeplechase Films, everyone at Zeitgeist and Kino Lorber, especially Emily Russo, Nancy Gerstmann, and Adrian Curry, plus the entire Film Forum staff who helped put this event together, especially our Deputy Director, Sonia Chung. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please consider making a donation to Film Forum's COVID-19 Emergency Fund and help us reopen our doors in the hopefully very near future. You can do so by going to filmforum.org/support. Finally, stay connected to us through our email newsletter and our social media handle, Film Forum NYC, at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We will keep you up to date with additions to our virtual cinema roster and any upcoming virtual events. Again, we wish you all health and happiness.